is this event not started business? I just edited this. And the titles are wrong. Okay, now it looks like the titles are right. See, now here it looks wrong. There it's right. Video blogging? Hmm. Hmm. Hello. It's time for the Henry George Daily Devotional. We continue with chapter 2, which I realize only had 2 paragraphs left. So we will finish that off. And then we start chapter 3, wages not drawn from capital but produced by labor. We left off George giving us his definition of capital. Oh, I had a typo here. Which is pretty much wealth that is intended to be used for generating or production of more wealth. Specifically, not something that the laborer would consume regardless of whether or not they even labored, like their food, clothing, or shelter. All right, here we go. Nor is this definition inconsistent with the idea that capital is that part of wealth devoted to production. It is too narrow an understanding of production which confines it merely to the making of things. Production includes not merely the making of things, but the bringing of them to the consumer. The merchant or storekeeper is thus as truly a producer as is the manufacturer or farmer, and his stock or capital is as much devoted to production as is theirs. But it is not worth while now to dwell upon the functions of capital, which we shall be better able to determine hereafter. Nor is the definition of capital I have suggested of any importance. I am not writing a textbook, but only attempting to discover the laws which control a great social problem. And if the reader has been led to form a clear idea of what things are meant when we speak of capital, my purpose is served. But before closing this digression, let me call attention to what is often forgotten, namely that the terms wealth, capital, wages, and the like, as used in political economy, are abstract terms, and that nothing can be generally affirmed or denied of them that cannot be affirmed or denied of the whole class of things they represent. The failure to bear this in mind has led to much confusion of thought, permits fallacies otherwise transparent to pass for obvious truths. Wealth being an abstract term, the idea of wealth, it must be remembered, involves the idea of exchangeability. The possession of wealth to a certain amount is potentially the possession of any or all species of wealth to that equivalent in exchange, and consequently, so of capital. All right. So we are done with Chapter 2. Chapter 3, the wage is not drawn from capital, but produced by the laborer. The importance of this digression will, I think, become more and more apparent as we proceed in our inquiry, but its pertinency to the branch we are now engaged in may at once be seen. It is at first glance evident that the economic meaning of the term wages is lost sight of, and attention is concentrated upon the common and narrow meaning of the word when it is affirmed that wages are drawn from capital. For in all those cases in which the laborer is his own employer and takes directly the produce of his labor as its reward, it is plain enough that wages are not drawn from capital but result directly as the product of the labor. I would like to mention here, for any company men, by which I mean people who play the video game Lethal Company, they might have a very intuitive understanding of how their wages come out of their labor. I continue. If, for instance, I devote my labor to gathering birds' eggs or picking wild berries, the eggs or berries I thus get are my wages. Surely no one will contend. Oh, great. The AI is. They're getting a pop up to try some AI experimental features. No, thank you. Surely no one will contend that in such a case wages are drawn from capital. There is no capital in the case. An absolutely naked man thrown on an island where no human being has before trod may gather birds' eggs or pick berries. Or, if I take a piece of leather and work it up into a pair of shoes, the shoes are my wages, the reward of my exertion. Surely they are not drawn from capital, either my capital or anyone else's capital, but are brought into existence by the labor of which they become the wages. And in obtaining this pair of shoes as the wages of my labor, capital is not even momentarily lessened one iota. For if we call in the idea of capital, my capital at the beginning consists of the piece of leather, the thread, etc. As my labor goes on, value is steadily added, until, when my labor results in the finished shoe, I have my capital plus the difference in value between the material and the shoes. In obtaining this additional value, my wages. How is capital at any time drawn upon? Adam Smith, who gave the direction to economic thought that has resulted in the current elaborate theories of the relation between wages and capital, recognized the fact that in such simple cases as I have instanced, wages are the produce of labor, and thus begins his chapter upon the wages of labor. Chapter 8 from Adam Smith says, quote, "The produce of labor constitutes the natural recompense or wages of labor. In that original state of things which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither landlord nor master to share with him." End quote. Back to George. Had the great Scotchman taken this as the initial point of his reasoning, and continued to regard the produce of labor as the natural wages of labor, then the landlord and master but as sharers, his conclusions would have been very different, and political economy today would not embrace such a mass of contradictions and absurdities, but instead of following the truth obvious in the simple modes of production as a clue through the perplexities of the more complicated forms, he momentarily recognizes it only immediately to abandon it, and stating that, quote, "In every part of Europe 20 workmen serve under a master for one that is independent," unquote. He recommences the inquiry from a point of view in which the master is considered as providing from his capital the wages of his workmen. It is evident that in thus placing the proportion of self-employing workmen as but 1 in 20, Adam Smith had in mind but the mechanic arts, and that, including all laborers, the proportion who take their earnings directly, without the intervention of an employer must, even in Europe 100 years ago, have been much greater than this. For, besides the independent laborer who in every community exists in considerable numbers, the agriculture of large districts of Europe has, since the time of the Roman Empire, been carried on by the metayer system. I don't know what that is. Under which the capitalist receives his return from the laborer instead of the laborer from the capitalist. At any rate, in the United States, where any general law of wages must apply as fully as in Europe, excuse me, and where, in spite of the advance of manufactures, a very large part of the people are yet self-employing farmers, the proportion of laborers who get their wages through an employer must be comparatively small. But it is not necessary to discuss the ratio in which self-employing laborers anywhere stand to hired laborers, nor is it necessary to multiply illustrations of the truism that where the laborer takes directly his wages, they are the product of his labor. For as soon as it is realized that the term wages includes all the earnings of labor, as well when taken directly by the laborer in the results of his labor as when received from an employer, it is evident that the assumption that wages are drawn from capital, on which, as a universal truth, such a vast superstructure is in standard economic treatises so unhesitatingly built, is at least in large part untrue, and the utmost that can with any plausibility be affirmed is that some wages, i.e., wages received by the laborer from an employer, are drawn from capital. I don't think George wants to grant that either, but he'll say like it's plausible. It's plausible you could think that some wages are drawn from capital. His restriction of the major premise. This is George talking again about Adam Smith. His restriction of the major premise at once invalidates all the deductions that are made from it. But without resting here, let us see whether, even in this restricted sense, it accords with the facts. Let us pick up the clue where Adam Smith dropped it, and advancing step by step, see whether the relations of facts, which is obvious in the simplest form of production, does not run through the most complex. Well, I'll leave that for tomorrow. We get to go through the most complex forms of production to see whether Adam Smith's ideas are applicable. See you tomorrow. This recording. Ooh. Oh, this was this one's 1 second. All right. That says 11. This is 13th. It's funny. I thought we had already established this, but that wage is not drawn from capital. George grinds his axe up over, over on, I don't know, about Adam Smith's inconsistency in that wages A definitely can't always be drawn from capital, but probably, but we'll see. But they, but, but B, see, they actually never are. Episode 13 on the 13th, huh? Wait a minute. Maybe this should be number 12. What is... Oh, today is Wednesday. Nope, that makes sense. No poll today. Let's... Does anyone... no one follows me, no one... 17 people saw this.
Hello.
17 is more than
Hello.
0.
Welcome.
Teen.
Henry George Daily Devotional.
Why is it called Flock of Dogs tutorializing the making of?
Devotional.
Okie doke. Artichoke. Okay, so this is when I will now end streaming to YouTube, or at least the Henry George Day Devotional channel, but YouTube in general.